Well, hello all, and thank you for joining us for the Whale Wide webinar. We will be discussing three endangered whales, the Cook Inlet belugas, southern resident orcas, and the North Atlantic right whales, and what Defenders is doing to protect these iconic species, and what actions you can take to fight for these beautiful creatures that are on the brink of extinction. We'll be dropping some action alerts during the presentation that will be linked in the follow-up email as well. So don't worry if you can't get to them right away. So to start, I am Alma Rosie Sanchez. My pronouns are she, her, aya, and I am the conservation coordinator of the Northwest as well as the Rocky Mountains and Great Plains program for Defenders of Wildlife. I am based out of Denver, Colorado, and I will be your host for this webinar. I will let each of the panelists introduce themselves before starting each of their topics. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that we are on stolen ancestral lands. The land that I stand on in Denver, Colorado is of the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Lakota, and Ute tribes. We want to take this time to recognize and honor their sovereignty, their cultures, and their role in conservation through history and the present, while also acknowledging past traumas that endure today. Through these conversations we will be having today, we intend to continue to reflect and acknowledge the people that have been and continue here since time immemorial. So, a little bit about Defenders and where we work. We are a DC-based organization with 6 field offices throughout the United States: the Northwest, California, the Southwest, the Rocky Mountains and Great Plains, Alaska, and the Southeast. Our work in the field enables us to be on the ground working on the front lines to protect and restore endangered and imperiled species. Today, each of us are calling from all around the US to tell you all about whales. So now our first question to you before we get started, please feel free to put your answers in the question and answer box. Have you ever seen a whale, and if so, where? Excited to see your responses, and with that, I will pass it over to Jane Davenport, who's a senior attorney with Defenders of Wildlife.
I'm Jane Davenport. I am an attorney in the conservation law program of Defenders of Wildlife. I'm based here in our headquarters office in DC. So we are on the traditional lands of the Piscataway peoples. And I just want to take a moment before we get started to talk about, why whales matter. Whales matter for a lot of reasons, and I'm sure some of these are going to be familiar to you and others may be a little bit new. So just a few of the many reasons why whales matter. They are an indicator species. They give us information about the problems that may show up in ecosystems. For example, many whales have body burdens of pollutants that tell us how an ecosystem is doing. Whales are also cultural icons, and that is certainly true not only for the environmental movement, which in some sense launched with the Save the Whales cry of the 70s, but also, and I think to really important to point out and recognize that whales around the world are central to many indigenous peoples' traditions. There are indigenous peoples who continue to have deep connections to the whales in their environment, whether it's a spiritual connection, a cultural connection, a subsistence connection. So, whales continue to be important to many people all around the world and have been since time immemorial. Here in the United States, we have 2 of the strongest laws in the world that protect whales and other marine mammals and endangered species. So the whales that we're going to talk about today are protected both by the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which applies to all species of marine mammals. So whales and dolphins and manatees and seals and sea lions and polar bears. But these whales are also, unfortunately, in a category as well where they are protected by the Endangered Species Act because their numbers have dropped to the point where they are at risk of extinction. And that is why defenders of wildlife work so hard on all three of these species to protect them using the legal tools and the advocacy tools that we have available to us so that we can protect them for all of these reasons, and so that future generations can look back and say, you know, you did your job. You kept these species around so that we could enjoy them into the future. And speaking for myself, and I think for my colleagues as well, we all take that responsibility very seriously. And it's why we do what we do. Putting a whale's worth in monetary terms is a really interesting exercise. And it's one that I think people might not be familiar with. But, you know, some economists have tried to put dollar amounts on what kinds of ecosystem services do whales provide to the environment and to us as human beings. And, you know, some of the more important functions that we already know about is that, you know, whales are essentially nutrient cyclers. They feed at depth and they come up to the surface, and when they eliminate, that's fertilizer. And that fertilizer helps increase our phytoplankton, the, you know, little tiny microcellular organisms, the plants that are the basis of the ocean food chain, of the ocean food web. So the fishing industry relies on whales to do that nutrient cycling to ensure healthy fish stocks. And as some of you may be familiar, whale watching as an industry contributes tremendous amounts of money to the economy in terms of ecotourism, not only with respect to the whale watch operations, but to all of the hotels and Airbnbs and restaurants and everyone who benefits from bringing that tourism into local communities. And, you know, whales do a tremendous amount of climate regulation because they keep carbon dioxide in their bodies. And, you know, not only are they cycling the nutrients in their life, but they cycle the nutrients in their deaths as well, because they take that carbon with them down to the ocean floor, and then their remains provide a platform for a tremendous diversity of deep sea life. So these are just some of the reasons why it's so important to protect whales, not only for their intrinsic and their inherent value, but for the very real services that they provide to the planet and that we depend on for, you know, our living. So this is an illustration of that nutrient cycling I was talking about, where the whales are feeding at depth and then they're bringing up that nutrient to the surface, because, as it says on here, they can't poop under pressure. So they feed down below, they poop on the surface, and that, you know, that nutrient cycle keeps going. And as a matter of fact, the oceans produce over 50% of the Earth's oxygen. So what we say is that for every other breath you take, you can thank a whale. And this, again, is just that graphic illustration of how important the whales are in the nutrient cycling. And one thing that I'd like to just mention here is that whale poop is not only important for fertilizer purposes and for, you know, feeding that food web, but it's also a real it's a way for humans to gather insight into how particular whale stocks are doing. So there are marine biologists who specialize in collecting whale poop and analyzing it for hormones to determine, you know, is an animal a male or a female? Who is it? You know, can we identify that animal from their DNA? Can we tell if that mom is pregnant? How healthy they are? So it's actually kind of a booming industry to track and observe whales through their poop, and also through the blow, because of course they're air-breathing mammals just like us, and there's also a lot of analysis that can be done by collecting the condensation from their blowholes when they breathe out. And of course, none of this is harmful to the animal. So it's a no harm way of doing research on these magnificent animals. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Katie Bear, to talk about the Cook Inlet beluga.
Thanks, Jane, for that great introduction and brief examples of why whales matter to us. Hello again, everyone. Again, my name is Katie Bear Nalvin. I'm the Alaska Marine representative with our Anchorage office. Anchorage is located within the traditional lands of the Dena'ina Athabascan peoples. Belugas are very social animals and are famous for making all sorts of noise. They have even earned the nickname canaries of the sea. Adult belugas are white and weigh about 3,000 pounds and are about 14 feet long. So they're about the size of the average SUV and the weight of a VW bug, or what I like to say, slug bugs. Baby belugas are born gray, like the one in the photo up above, and they develop that iconic white coloration as they mature. The waters where belugas live, like Cook Inlet, are often icy, have low visibility, and are often silty and dark. So belugas have some adaptations that make it possible for them to live in these conditions, such as they have a thick blubber layer that keeps them warm in these cold temperatures. And to navigate the dark and low visibility waters, belugas rely heavily on their advanced echolocation abilities to find prey, to hunt, communicate, and avoid predators. Also, unlike many other whales and dolphins, the vertebrae in a beluga's neck are not fused together, which means they have much greater flexibility and can move their heads around. And speaking of their heads are what we are bulbous. They're known as a melon, and their melon is made up of fatty adipose tissue, which helps them echolocate. They can even move this melon around to help direct and receive sound waves. And belugas, they lack a dorsal fin, which makes it easier for them to swim under ice, especially when avoiding predators like orcas, which have a very large dorsal fin. But that is a different type of orca than what Rob will be talking about in a bit. Next slide, please. Belugas are found globally throughout the Arctic Ocean with 5 stocks here in Alaska. Alaska is a very big place, so this map can help orient us to the specific population we're going to be talking about, Cook Inlet belugas. Cook Inlet belugas are geographically and genetically isolated from all other beluga populations. Cook Inlet belugas do not travel outside of Cook Inlet, and they do not mix with any other beluga populations, meaning that there's no replacement for them if they are gone. The historical population estimate is right around 1,300 individuals. Locals used to say that when the belugas would swim by, there were so many it looked like white caps in the inlet. But sadly, the population has declined over 75% from that historical estimate, and the current population estimate is just 279 individuals. The population is currently declining at 2.3% a year. Belugas have been and still are an important subsistence resource for the native peoples of the Arctic and beyond. Along Cook Inlet, or the Cook Inlet, which is traditionally known as Nuti, the Tabona people, which means people of the beach, have traditionally used beluga for clothing, shelter, heating, and as a food resource. Recognizing the importance of conservation, the Tabona and other native Alaskans of Cook Inlet voluntarily ended their subsistence hunt of belugas in 2005. I can only imagine that that must have been a significant sacrifice. Regardless, the relationship between the Tabona remains strong, and their demonstrated commitment to conservation should be admired. The native people who live near belugas and depend on their resources have thousands of years of knowledge about their species, and this knowledge, the traditional knowledge, are as valuable as all other forms of research about this population, and we work to incorporate this perspective into our work. The Cook Inlet belugas continue to decline despite a moratorium on hunting and conservation measures taken to date. We are unsure exactly why the population continues to decline, but what is clear is that we need to be as precautionary as possible. NOAA believes the initial decline of the Cook Inlet belugas was most likely due to all forms of unregulated hunting at a level the small population could not sustain. Although the hunt has been suspended since 2005, the population has not recovered as expected. What this population shows us is that there is a significant increase from the end of hunting to 2010, and then a significant and continued decline ever since 2010, despite that moratorium on hunting. Belugas play a key role in both the Cook Inlet ecosystem and culture, but as we just saw, the population isn't doing well, and they are exposed to a variety of stressors and threats, such as habitat degradation, oil and gas exploration, noise pollution, strandings, and climate change. It is very difficult to understand the magnitude or intensity to which each of these threats and others can harm belugas, and it's likely a culmination of all of these factors that's limiting the Cook Inlet belugas from recovery. Likewise, Anchorage is the largest population center in Alaska. Over 65% of Alaska's population resides along Cook Inlet. For these reasons, it's important that we're as precautionary as possible and we work to mitigate any harm to this very vulnerable population. So what we do here at Defenders is we do have a pretty expansive beluga program. We work through partnerships, we do education and outreach, monitoring, and advocacy. Most of our beluga work is accomplished through our ever-deepening partnerships. Some examples of those include our work with the Alaska Beluga Whale Monitoring Partnership that I'll be talking about in a little bit, the native village of Tyonek, home to the Tabona people, other NGOs and conservation groups, as well as federal and state agencies. We work to promote education and outreach efforts about the belugas. In the past, we hosted a Cook Inlet Beluga education program where we brought 75 third graders out to see belugas and participate in monitoring sessions. We hope to continue this program sometime in the future. We have also made several educational materials, including workbooks, fact sheets, worksheets, and all of these can be found on our website. And our worksheet in particular walks kiddos or adults, anybody can do it, there's no age limit, through graphing the population with the real count data and asking some questions as you go along. And if you're interested in any of those materials, just say something in the Q&A box and we'll gladly post the link to you. And we work with students in a number of ways, but one of our most significant is through our internships with Defenders. Our interns work on a variety of different projects that vary year to year, and our past summer intern spent a lot of her time on belugas. We also have a beluga story map, an animated video, and we just hosted our first ever Beluga Palooza online celebration, which had 3 nights of events, including a virtual paint night. We host and co-host sites for the Alaska Beluga Monitoring Partnership and Belugas Count. Both of these programs rely heavily on volunteers to help us gather data. The data helps us to better understand how belugas use Cook Inlet and during what times of year. So if you're in Alaska or when you come to visit us, contact us to find out how you can get involved in monitoring, which helps science and also see our belugas. We work with lawyers, policy experts, scientists, and other partners to engage in science-based advocacy. We pushed for the Cook Inlet beluga population to be listed under the Endangered Species Act in 2008 and designate critical habitat for them. Today, we closely watch what is happening in Cook Inlet. We review all actions proposed in the inlet and submit comment letters to the proper agency. And lastly, there's a lot you can do to help us and help the belugas. We have a couple of actions that are live right now that pertain directly to Cook Inlet belugas, and we'll put links in the Q&A box, and we'll also send out links later on. But the first action is to tell the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation to stop permitting the industry to dump waste in Cook Inlet. And the second action has a comment period which ends on October 13th, and this action is targeted at BOEM, so the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, to choose their, quote, no action alternative of not holding a lease sale in Cook Inlet. So with that, thank you everyone, and I will now pass it over to Rob.
Thanks, Katie Bear. Rosie, you can go to the next slide, please. My name is Rob Crable. I'm a Northwest representative with Defenders of Wildlife, and I am calling from my home office in beautiful Tacoma, Washington, which is on the lands of the Puyallup tribe, who have lived here and stewarded the natural resources of the area since time immemorial. And I want to take a moment just to express my gratitude for the great work that the Puyallup Indian Nation has done and continues to do in protecting the Puyallup watershed and the Salish Sea. Today I'm here to talk to you about our work with the southern resident orcas, another extremely endangered population of whales in the United States. Orcas across the globe are often called the wolves of the sea, and I like to remind people that because we are defenders of wildlife. We have a wolf on our logo, And they're called the wolves of the sea because, like wolves, they are extremely effective top predators who hunt in packs. The southern residents are a unique population of orcas. They make up a single clan, and within that clan are 3 different family groups or pods. They are J, K, and L pod. Like all orcas, the southern residents are structured in a matriarchal society, which means that the females are in charge and they dictate where the pod goes. Not the worst idea in the world, I'll say. And unlike other orcas, though, the southern residents have a very unique diet. As Katie Bear mentioned, there are orcas that hunt marine mammals, but the southern residents, having evolved in the Pacific Northwest, evolved to hunt salmon, and in particular, Chinook salmon, which is the largest of the salmon species in the Pacific. And as Jane mentioned earlier, all whales have cultural importance, but the southern residents are especially important to the dozens of tribes and First Nations who live throughout Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia today. Many of the tribes that we work with view the southern residents as extended family members. So they're more than just another endangered wildlife species to so many people here in the Pacific Northwest. And while they're called southern resident orcas, the southern residents are not found year-round in the Salish Sea, which includes Puget Sound, which is what a lot of folks know the region as. But the southern residents actually have a much, much more extensive range, going all the way down to Monterey Bay, California. And the reason for this is that the southern residents are following their prey, the salmon. Salmon throughout the Pacific Northwest are spawning at different times. During the summer, you'll see the orcas closer to the San Juan Islands and Victoria and Vancouver, which is where the salmon are. Then in the fall, they start to head down towards my neck of the woods in the South Salish Sea. And then during the winter and spring, they're found fairly regularly out on the coast hunting for salmon out there. So while we call them residents, they do travel. Sadly, the southern residents are extremely endangered and have quite a sad story. We first started to pay attention to them as a unique population in the 60s and 70s when companies like SeaWorld and others were coming into the Salish Sea to drop bombs underwater, corral orcas into coves, and capture them to take them to aquariums and marine parks throughout the world. This had a huge and devastating impact both on the number of whales and also was just a very traumatic experience for the whales who were present, as most of the whales captured were calves that were dragged away from their mothers. Fortunately, under Republican leadership in the state, the capture of live whales was banned in 1975, and the orcas started to recover. But as you can see by this graph, they started to decline in the mid-90s and have continued to decline since. Today, there are just 74 orcas left in the population. This was really put on full display to the world 2 summers ago. I imagine several of you, if you're all whale fans, have seen this image. This was from the summer of 2018 when an orca mother known as Tahlequah gave birth to a calf who died within an hour of her giving birth to it. And she carried that dead calf through the water for 17 days and over 1,000 miles. This is the longest that this type of behavior has ever been seen in any marine mammal. And many people were moved to swift action because of this call for help that many folks saw from the southern residents. So while many people are motivated to help save the southern residents from extinction, the first step is to understand what it is that we need to do to help them. According to the best scientists, there are 3 major threats to the southern residents orcas. The first is a lack of their primary prey, salmon, and in particular Chinook salmon. Due to years of development, habitat loss, damming of rivers, salmon runs across the Pacific Northwest have plummeted, leaving fewer and fewer fish for the orcas to eat. Second is toxic pollution. There's a lot of pollution that runs off of our streets, buildings, and lawns into the Salish Sea, contaminating salmon and further degrading salmon habitat, which also means that there are fewer fish for the whales to eat. And lastly, underwater noise. Like all marine mammals, orcas use echolocation to communicate with each other and find their food. But these orcas spend a lot of time next to some of the busiest ports on the West Coast, making it hard for them to hear each other and find food. So in summary, there's not enough food for them to eat. What's out there is not high quality, and it's really hard to find what is out there. So what are we doing about it? Like Katie Bear up in Alaska and Jane over in DC, We do a lot of advocacy here in the Pacific Northwest at both the state and federal level. At the federal level, I oftentimes fly over to DC and spend a lot of time working with our congressional delegation to ensure that more funding is available for Puget Sound habitat restoration to make sure that there are healthy salmon runs for the southern resident orcas into the future. We've also participated heavily in state processes like Governor Inslee's Southern Resident Orca Task Force. I served as a member of a working group there and also continued to advocate for the recommendations of the task force through the legislative session in 2018, which we successfully passed 4 different bills and a very robust budget that were all aimed at protecting and recovering southern resident orcas. Perhaps the biggest campaign that we work on is the campaign to restore the Lower Snake River, though. There are 4 dams on the Lower Snake River, which is the largest tributary to the Columbia River. And as I mentioned earlier, the whales will spend time out on the coast during the winter, and the Columbia River is a hot spot for the southern resident orcas to gather and hunt for salmon. Unfortunately, the 4 dams on the Lower Snake River have been cited as especially problematic due to the fact that they are decreasingly useful in their role to society as a whole, and also in the role that they play in warming the water temperatures on both the Snake and Columbia rivers to lethal temperatures for salmon. Scientists have predicted that if we remove the 4 Lower Snake River dams, we could have 1 million salmon returning to the mouth of the Columbia River every single year, and it would open up access for salmon to over 5,000 miles of free-flowing habitat in Southeast Washington, Northeast Oregon, and Central Idaho. This would be the largest salmon recovery project in the history of the country. So we participate not only in the advocacy efforts, but also in the on-the-ground community events. These are some photos from the Free the Snake Flotilla, which, as with so many things, didn't happen this year. But this is an on-water gathering of tribal nations from across the Northwest, recreational fishing communities, and environmental advocates to float on the dammed river to call for it to be restored to a free-flowing state. We also have a hands-on, on-the-ground project here in Tacoma called Orcas Love Rain Gardens. As I mentioned earlier, pollution is a big problem for the southern residents and salmon, and the largest source of pollution entering the Salish Sea is stormwater runoff. Every time that it rains out here in the Northwest, which happens quite a lot, all of the toxics that are on our buildings, roads, and lawns get swirled together in a toxic soup and flows untreated into our local waterways. This contaminates the food chain and also further degrades habitat. To reduce the impact of stormwater runoff, we have rain gardens. These are bowl-shaped landscaping features that can collect and slowly absorb and filter stormwater runoff. A lot of great science done here in the Northwest has shown that these types of gardens can effectively remove over 99% of the toxics in the water and make it clean enough for salmon to survive in the resulting filtered water indefinitely. So we have focused here in Tacoma with our program on projects at schools and parks throughout the community. These public places are great opportunities for us to both install large rain gardens so we can capture more stormwater, but they're also a great educational opportunity. These are some photos from the last several years of us working with students throughout Tacoma to plant and maintain rain gardens on school property. And it gives them the opportunity not only to have some ownership in southern resident orca recovery, but we also hope that this will instill a conservation ethic in these kids for years to come and help to normalize the idea of rain gardens in our as a key part of our infrastructure. So I like to end things on a positive note with the southern residents because they do have a very long and tragic story, but there is still hope for this unique population. In 2019, we had 2 calves that were born to the population, one to J-pod and one to L-pod. And that was good news on its own. But in 2020, already this month, we have seen 2 successful births of calves in J-pod, including one birth to the mother orca Tahlequah, who I mentioned earlier, who 2 years ago carried her dead calf through the water. So she is now a mother of a healthy, happy, and from what I've heard, spunky orca calf. So with belugas, there's so much that needs to be done to help save these orcas from extinction. But the two things that I'll be sharing with you all today are one, our action alert on breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams. We're building a lot of support for this across the region and across the country. So we're really trying to deliver a message that these dams need to be removed to save our southern resident orcas. Secondly, if you are stuck at home, like I am, looking for some projects in your yard, we'll share a video with some simple steps on how you can install a rain garden at your home. Even if you don't live here in the Pacific Northwest, rain gardens are great to add to any yard for any wildlife species. And I encourage you to do some research into your local governments to see if there are any programs to help pay for those rain gardens. There are a lot of assistance programs out there. So with that, I will now turn things back over to my esteemed colleague, Jane Davenport, to discuss North Atlantic right whales.
So I'm going to close us out in our whale-wide webinar today by moving us over to the East Coast. So North Atlantic right whales are a large migratory whale species, and they migrate up and down the eastern seaboard from the waters in Atlantic Canada all the way down to Florida. So the North Atlantic right whale, as you can see from the picture on the left-hand side, it's a filter feeding whale. So that's called a baleen whale. And those are basically its teeth, and they're very, very long pieces of like a hair-like material that filter out plankton from the water. So just like Cook Inlet belugas and southern resident killer whales, right whales are also carnivores. But the animals that they're eating are zooplankton on the very, very bottom of the food chain. And these whales take enormous gulps of water. They target where the zooplankton concentrate because as you can imagine, it takes a whole lot of zooplankton to grow a whale that is this large. So I want to talk about how the right whale got its name. The story goes that it got its name because it was the right whale to hunt. Now, this is a picture back from 1856, and this is basically how Yankee whaling in New England came to be such a driver of economic development and industrialization in New England in the 19th century. These whaling vessels would go offshore and they would target North Atlantic right whales because these whales are, number one, huge. They have an enormous amount of blubber. So they were very valuable whales to hunt, and because the whales were being targeted for their blubber. This was basically the oil that the Industrial Revolution ran on before we started using, underground oil. So these whales were valuable to the whalers at the time for their fat, for their blubber. Right whales also swim very slowly, and because they're so fat and fat is buoyant, they would float when they were harpooned. So they're slow, they're close to the shore, easy to hunt, and very valuable when they were hunted. So that's the story of how they got their name. So unfortunately, it was during this era of Yankee whaling that their numbers plummeted. And, we have to look at, essentially extremely old bones and, information to try to back calculate what the population of North Atlantic right whales was. So the best estimates I've seen is that before Yankee whaling got underway, there were probably about 10,000 North Atlantic right whales. And there used to actually be right whales over on the other side of the Atlantic off the coast of Europe as well. But those were extirpated by hunting quite a while ago. So when the Yankee whalers basically fished out all the North Atlantic right whales, that's when they started developing bigger ships to go, further afield to go hunt, whales in the deep ocean. So by the time that whaling for North Atlantic right whales was finally banned in 1936. The population had plummeted down to no more than 200 whales. And, for a long time, people just didn't know if the right whale was going to survive. The right whale, after we stopped killing it with harpoons, was on a slow road to recovery. I mean, these whales, they have a calf about every 3 years, and so their population growth is slow. But when we stopped harpooning them, they started doing what whales do, having babies. But unfortunately, in the more modern era, we're still continuing to kill whales. We're still continuing to kill right whales. It's just that we don't do it on purpose with harpoons anymore. So the two major causes of right whale deaths now, number one, they get hit by ships. And number two, they get entangled in fishing gear. So those are the two major causes of right whale mortality that I want to talk about today. And just to point out that we don't have any old right whales. We actually don't know how long a right whale could live. Like, best estimates from looking at their cousins, the bowhead whale, is that North Atlantic right whales could probably live to be 80 or 100 years old. But the problem is that they get killed by human action. So there's no senior citizen whales around, because generally they've been killed by a ship strike or by an entanglement by the time they're 30 or 40 years old. So I want to talk first of all about entanglements and why entanglements are such a major driver of right whale mortality. Right whales, because they swim, fairly close to the shore, this is also, of course, where a lot of fishing occurs. So one of the major dangers for right whales as they're swimming up and down the East Coast is that these are also where, very, very valuable, very economically valuable fisheries are for the American lobster, for crab, for other fish that are like caught in traps or pots on the bottom of the seafloor. And when those traps are put on the bottom of the seafloor, they're connected to a surface buoy by these vertical lines. And as the whales are swimming along, it's like they're swimming through a minefield. They can't avoid these lines, and when they run into them, they panic. They don't know what's going on, and they will often spin in like a panic response, and that's when the lines will get tangled up around them. And the other thing to know about these whales is they're incredibly strong. These are really big whales. If anyone's ever gone whale watching and seen a humpback whale, right whales are 3 times the size of a humpback whale, and they're very strong. So instead of being anchored, what they will do is they will often swim off with all this broken gear, but they're dragging it with them. So the other big problem is ship strikes. Like the Cook Inlet beluga, the North Atlantic right whale doesn't have a dorsal fin. And it's also dark. It's a very dark colored whale, so it's very difficult to see it in the water, and it often swims under the surface. So as you can tell from the picture on the left, if you can look at the bottom quarter of that picture, that's a North Atlantic right whale, and you see that giant cargo ship that absolutely dwarfs it in size. And these cargo vessels, tankers, cruise ships, high-speed ferries, they can't see the right whales, and because of how noise works underwater, you'd think that the right whales would hear the noise and be able to get out of the way, but unfortunately, because how noise travels underwater, it doesn't work the way you think it works, and whales just can't get out of the way. So this is unfortunately because they are so close to our coasts, and in fact they've been called the urban whale. where they are at different times of the year overlaps with some of our busiest ports on the East Coast, from Boston to New York to Norfolk, all the way down the coast. The whales are often swimming through where so much of our commercial vessel traffic is going. So some of the many things that Defenders has done to try to protect the right whales from these threats, and this is work that Defenders of Wildlife has been doing for more than 15 years now. One of the things that scientists observed is that right whales had a very predictable migration pattern. You were practically able to set your watch by, if it's this month, the right whales are going to be off this part of the coast. So starting in the very early 2000s, Defenders of Wildlife was advocating to the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Coast Guard to set speed limits, right? These are kind of like school zones where you drive more slowly in a school zone because, it's riskier in a school zone at certain times of the day and near schools for kids. And so just in the same way, it was determined that it was riskier in certain times of the year and in certain places for right whales. And so what they've discovered is if ships slow down to 10 nautical miles an hour or slower, the whales can get out of the way and any collisions are not likely to be fatal. So this map shows the speed limit rule that went into effect after a lot of work, including litigation, by Defenders and our conservation allies to try to get this speed rule into place. And certainly in the initial years, the rule really proved itself to be a great success. And although it did slow vessel traffic down, the economic analyses showed that it really was a very cost-effective rule. It didn't impose any significant costs on the commercial shipping industry. So the other issue here that is so dangerous for the whales is gear entanglement. And as I said, when whales are swimming through these minefields of gear and they get trapped in it, it can trap them in a bunch of different ways. As you can see from these pictures, they can get ropes tangled around their flukes, their tails. If you can see from the picture on the right, this whale has got so much rope through its mouth that it's baleen, its teeth. You can see how the rope has gotten all tangled up in there. So, many marine mammals that are smaller, like humpbacks, like minke whales, if they get tangled up in fishing gear and they can't get to the surface, they'll drown. But generally what happens with right whales, because they are so big and so strong, is that unfortunately these gear entanglements cause a tremendous amount of suffering. The ropes can eat into their flesh and cause infections. As you can see from the picture on the right, a whale that has all this gear through its mouth, it isn't going to be able to filter feed. So, all of this can happen to the whales, and, extremely tragically, it can just cause these terrible injuries and a terrible amount of suffering that we just don't see because it's out there in the ocean. And in addition to killing whales through starvation, through these wounds, through infection, what scientists have figured out is that when female whales are dragging around this gear, which happens frequently, 85% of all right whales have at least one set of scars from being entangled in their lives. And it's become such a common occurrence to whales that it's affecting the other end of the scale. It's causing their birth rates to plummet. If you remember, I said that a right whale female usually has a baby once every 3 to 4 years. But the way she does that is in the off years, she has to build up her body fat so that she can turn it into a calf, and then she can nurse that calf and grow that calf. So she's got to get really big and fat with all that blubber to be able to have a baby. It is such a drag on her energy when she's dragging around this really heavy gear and she's burning all these calories dragging around this really heavy fishing gear that now the calving interval, the time between having one baby and the next baby, has gone to 10 years. And right whales don't become mature to have babies until they're 10 years old. And then they're dead by 30 or 40. So unfortunately, it's just simple math. We're not giving them the room and the freedom they need, not only to survive, but also to reproduce. And unfortunately, the threats of entanglement and ship strikes are not the only threats that right whales face. Just like Cook Inlet belugas and southern resident whales, these animals depend on hearing and sound in the ocean, not their eyes, because you can't see very well in the ocean. So they're absolutely dependent on sound. And not only is there just a ton of noise from vessels, from construction, but off the East Coast, very recently, there's been a real drive to explore for underwater oil and gas deposits. And the way they do that is vessels trail these arrays of air cannons that they fire at the surface of the sea every 10 seconds, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the sound coming back can help them map if there is oil or gas or not. And so fortunately, this is something that defenders and many other environmental groups have been fighting in court to stop this kind of seismic blasting in right whale habitat from going forward. And, we've been successful so far, but it's something that we are very concerned about going into the future. So let's talk about more positive things, because I know it's really kind of awful to think about the threats that these whales face. So defenders and our conservation allies have been working really hard in Congress to promote a bill called the Save Right Whales Act. And what this bill would do is invest federal dollars to the tune of $5 million a year for 10 years to develop technologies, because there are solutions to these problems. There are different types of fishing gear that can be developed. There's, potential research into changing the hull design of ships so that they don't have the same kind of sound masking. So this bill is something that we've been promoting, and it's gotten bipartisan support. We've had both Democrats and Republicans sign on to this to recognize that, this is a problem that's solvable, but we do need the resources to get the research. And we've also been working on appropriations in Congress every year. And this year we got $6 million to put into this life-saving research for right whales. And one of the ways that, we're very optimistic that this federal investment can develop the research is, the traps that catch lobsters and crabs that are on the seafloor, the traps don't kill whales. It's the lines that kill whales. And fishing with rope, it's essentially a technology that hasn't changed for, hundreds and hundreds of years, except the ropes have gotten so much stronger that the whales can't break out of them. So what these slides are showing is so-called ropeless gear, where there's, if you look at the picture on the right, that picture is of basically a lobster trap, but the trap itself has rope in it, along with some buoys, so that, as the picture on the left shows, when the fishing vessel puts the traps down, and it's kind of like a garage door opener, right? They have the technology sends a unique signal, so not everybody can pop it up. Only the owner of that fishing gear can pop it up. So the fisherman, lets the gear soak, catch lobster, crab, comes back, and then sends it this garage door opener signal to open this trap. And, the buoys come up, the rope comes up, and then the fisherman can retrieve his gear and his catch, just like normal. So, this is not shelf ready yet, but there's a tremendous amount of research and testing that's being done by scientists and engineers and fishermen in both the US and Canada. And they've made tremendous progress over the past several years. In closing, again, these whales face so many threats, but we still have hope. We know that we can do things to protect them from ship strikes and from entanglements. So what we're urging all of our supporters to do is to take action through our action alert, to tell your representatives, tell your senators, to invest the money, the federal investment dollars, to help find solutions, because we don't have to keep killing whales with fishing gear. We can keep fishing with modern gear. We can keep shipping going with more modern designs and coexist with these amazing animals. So thank you for your attention, and we are now ready to take questions.
Thank you, presenters. I want to emphasize that we need to see bold leadership from our agencies in order to save these whales. Every time you sign an action alert, you are joining with us to tell agencies to do everything they can to save our whales. So please do sign our action alerts, and you can always visit defenders.org/action and follow us on social media, Defenders of Wildlife. The action alerts I'll go ahead and send in the follow-up email as well, so you have all of those along with the YouTube video of this presentation. I do want to be conscientious of the time that we have, and it's about 4 minutes to the hour, so I will go ahead and try to answer as many questions as possible. But again, with the follow-up email, I'll be sure to include our emails. If you have any questions specifically for us that were not answered, please feel free to email us directly. So this is a question from Stacy Loeb, and this is directed to Katie Bear. How is the habitat of Cook Inlet belugas being degraded? Is it due to plastics or runoff from industrial agriculture?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that, Stacy, and I'm happy to clarify. Habitat degradation is like a really broad term and can include a lot of different types of impacts. For our Cook Inlet belugas specifically, Cook Inlet is an industrialized area, especially in the terms of Alaska. There's lots of shipping traffic, which can lead to all sorts of effects like noise pollution and also the possibility of ship strike. And there's also all sorts of runoff issues and toxic dumping issues going on in Cook Inlet that we're working to mitigate, as well as other types of impacts too. So plastic pollution is, again, something that could be considered under that umbrella as well.
Thank you, Katie Bear. This next one is for Rob. And this is from Ellen Weinstein. I have read that there is quite a bit of radiation in the Pacific from Fukushima. How did this affect the southern resident orcas directly and their food source, salmon?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any research showing any specific impacts from the Fukushima reactor issue. I do know that anecdotally there was a lot of trash that washed ashore Washington and Oregon beaches that had Japanese printed on it, that a lot of folks think came from Fukushima. So I'm not sure if there's a direct correlation that we can clearly draw, but obviously we don't want nuclear radiation or plastic pollution in the ocean. It's bad for the whales and bad for the entire ecosystem.
Thank you, Rob. And I'll just get to this last question, which is for Jane. And what kind of response do you get from petroleum industry using sound to locate oil reserves?
Well, that is one where there's not a lot of cooperation to be found. The oil industry, as you can imagine, is extremely well funded, and its lobby organization and has basically more money than God and access to all the best lawyers. So, and the oil industry also has a very long planning horizon, right? They're not, looking at developing oil 2 years from now or 10 years from now. They plan out 50, 100 years. So we have been fighting in court for more than 2 years now against permits that were issued by the National Marine Fisheries Service to under the Marine Mammal Protection Act to authorize the harassment of species that results from seismic blasting. And seismic blasting, it's the loudest sound that we create underwater except for military explosions. And the sound, as you know, sound travels through water. It can travel from one side of the ocean to the other. It just, it doesn't stay localized. It propagates throughout the entire ocean. So, like I said, we've been fighting this in court for 2 years, and we have, we've also helped develop a tremendous amount of bipartisan opposition to this offshore oil drilling, because, people on the coastal communities, they depend on fishing, they depend on tourism. They know that if there's, another Deepwater Horizon off the shores, that it tanks the fishing industry. I mean, the Gulf is still suffering the impacts of Deepwater Horizon. So, it is a bipartisan issue to oppose oil drilling in the Atlantic, because the stakes are so high. It's profit for such a small, narrow range of people and potential economic downside for the rest of us. Fortunately, because we have tools like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, like the Endangered Species Act, like the National Environmental Policy Act, and we have a court system where citizens like you and me and representational groups like Defenders of Wildlife that can go to court on behalf of our members and stand up to the oil industry, Freudian slip there. We can stand up to the extraction industries, whether they're targeting our federal lands, our public lands, or they're targeting our offshore lands, because these lands and waters belong to us. They're a public resource. They are not private property. So we have the ability to go to court under these statutes and say, no, you've done it wrong. You're not basing your decisions on science. You're violating the law. And, we have the power to stop these actions in court. And I think that's not true in every country. We're very fortunate in this country to have a free judiciary and the right to pursue these claims, because that's not true across the entire world. So we're not making any friends in the oil industry, but that's not what we're here to do. We're here to say these are our lands and these are our waters and these are a public resource and they should be protected for the public. So that's why we will fight offshore oil development, including seismic blasting and exploration, until our last breath.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was a really great answer. And thank you all to all the participants for being here during this extremely unprecedented time in our history. You've made the time to learn and take action for these imperiled species. And from all of us at Defenders, we want to thank you all. Be sure to look out for my follow-up email coming at you in the next couple of days. And once again, if your questions weren't answered, our emails will be in the follow-up email, so you can send us your questions directly. Thank you all so much for joining. Once again, want to be conscientious of the time. Look for that follow-up email. Thanks all.